Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to another Supatease video, and we are through another week of the War Within Season 1 PvP. We just concluded the third week of the Arena World Championship Series with only one cup remaining before the teams qualify into the Grand Finals, and I wanted to do another PvP analysis, which is looking at the representation of all of the specializations, throwing in a little bit of my opinion and assessments from the tournament, as well as ladder gameplay in terms of how much did the previous PvP changes really affect the ladder, what direction should they continue from here, and that's basically the gist of it. So I've got a direct side-by-side comparison. I got a couple of pictures here lined up for us to look at. So we've got, this was last week basically that we did the PvP analysis, and I just wanted to take a look and like do just a side-by-side, like what's happened. So obviously Unholy Death Knight, I'd say, was nerfed the most heavily of any specialization, and you could see a drop off. Last week they were at 22%. This is above 1800 rating. They were at 22% last week. This week they're only at 19%, and I kind of do expect this number to continue to go down. Now they're still at a staggering 19%, right? They're still in the #1 position. This is again likely a lingering factor to players have already leveled that character, geared that character, and there's a lot of friction in order to switch from that class to something else that is either going to take a long time to happen. So the fact that it dropped 4% honestly seems like a big number in 1 week because of all the friction that I've just described in terms of re-rolling. So this is still pretty high. I would really like to see their single target get some type of compensation. I think that the specialization got nerfed because it does an insane amount of AoE damage in Battlegrounds, but that damage was like, you know, barely really making it work in a 3v3 arena environment. So seeing some more of their single target abilities receive some buffs would be nice, even though they're in a #1 position, because I do kind of anticipate this to continue to go on a downward trend. Fury Warrior, last week we saw it at 17.4%. It's now at 16.1%, and Fury Warrior received Slayer nerfs, so it was more or less kind of nerfs to it, a little bit of buffs to it. I think it's kind of still on a downward trend just because of the ranged DPS that are popular at the moment. Whether it's Shadow Priest because they're completely unkillable, or mages because you can't catch them, hunters because you can't catch them. I think the main reason that Warrior is starting to drop on this list is mostly just because certain ranged DPS are so prevalent and so strong at the moment. And Fury Warrior, it used to be the counter to things like Shadow Priest, but Shadow Priest is just so strong now that it's not even the counter to that. So my expectation is it'll probably continue to go down. Feral Druid last week was at 11%, and it's climbed up to almost 13%. So almost a 2% bump increase for Feral Druid, even despite the nerfs to their Ferocious Bite Honor talent. Now, the main reason that was brought up to me, I had a discussion with Vinruki and Zico after the tournament, and a lot of discussion was talking about this PvP talent, King of the Jungle. For every enemy you have Rip active on, your movement speed and healing received is increased by 5%. So you can see there's a lot of pets in the game. So if you're playing any sort of AoE Rip build or getting AoE multi-dots, you're going to get just 20% healing received. That's a lot. That just from your own healing, that's from your teammates, that's from everything. So this PvP talent in particular is adding a lot of extra, you know, durability. It's why we saw in the Grand Finals of North America, Welcome to the Jungle, we're playing Feral, Shadow Priest, Holy Paladin. There's things we'll go into with Shadow Priest as well as we get to it, but I think this is like a main contributing factor to why they feel so durable, why they feel so tanky, and it's a PvP talent. So I really think that this is something that could really easily be addressed. You just nerf it by 50% because it's not usable in PvE. It doesn't affect PvE at all, and it would help put Feral Druid. I would say their defense is like the main culprit at the moment. You know, anytime there's a class that just is kind of like invulnerable to death until dampening, that's the spec that we see creep up a lot in tournaments. That's the spec that kind of just becomes overrepresented. And they've said that they don't want that because they've been, you know, working on Warlock and taking away their self-healing, and Warlock's getting into a more healthy spot. Boomkin's getting into a more healthy spot. They brought down a lot of survivability on some specs, but Feral Druid still is an outlier. I would honestly think that this would be a nice mid-ground position to try and go after something like this. Obviously, their incarnation is really powerful, and they brought that down to a 2-minute cooldown, and that's something that might needs addressing as well. But taking step by step, I think, would be better than, you know, sledgehammer like DK. So this is the first thing that I was thinking that would be good to go after for Feral Druid, because obviously these numbers are pretty decently comparable, right? When we're looking at the overall representation, this is honestly like one of the best PvP seasons, because typically it's like there's only one melee, there's only one ranged. But when you look at the breakdown, this is actually a pretty healthy breakdown of the percentages. So I don't want Feral Druid to get sledgehammered out like Unholy Death Knight. So I think targeting that oriented to around their defense to make them a bit squishy last year would be a healthy way of doing it. It's a PvP only talent. Windwalker Monk, your representation, it stayed about the same. There's more monks above 1800, but your overall percent between the other specs is the same at around 12%. Windwalker, again, similar to Warriors, probably having the same frustrations with certain range DPS and how they can kite. Although you do have more tools now, things like Clash to pull targets to you, I think has helped enabled it. Windwalker a lot more. And the Whirling Dragon Punch, as much as casters hate it, have helped Windwalkers be able to get uptime by knocking enemies up. Basically a stun that's off of DR, which has enabled it. But like I've seen main Windwalker Monk players that are kind of frustrated by it, but its representation is still decently high. And obviously its defense is where it's the most solid. I'd say Feral Druid and Windwalker are probably the hardest specializations to kill in the game, at least as far as melee are concerned. And I think that's kind of carrying its representation at the moment because it's going to be super new player friendly just because you're really tanky and you have a ton of defensive cooldowns. So honestly, maybe you just leave Windwalker as it is, look at the other melee and try and find ways to bring them down a little bit. Warrior might need something. I don't know exactly where you can go with this. I know they had a PP talent, or it is a hero talent where it was like, when you charge, it removed roots, and then they made it not remove roots, and then I was thinking like this is super OP because it removes roots, but now it's like you're playing the game and like maybe it wouldn't have been that OP, so maybe bringing that back or something for Warrior could actually be on the table. Rep Paladins, your representation didn't really change too much from last week to this week. You're 7.3%, you're 7.84%. We saw the Templar buffs, but even in the tournament, Kara was the first person to play Rep Paladin, and he was still playing Herald of the Sun, so I don't know if the Templar buffs are really enough to put Ret kind of like into the playing field in terms of like top echelon power. And you can see this is like where the first drop off happens. It's like half the representation from 12 and 13 down to 7 or 8. There's a significant drop off there for Rep Paladin specifically. You probably have to continue to look at, you know, buffing Templar maybe a bit more for PvP specifically. Again, I think bringing down Feral defense is a better direction still. You know, bringing it down to where Rep Paladins and Warriors and Death Knights are in terms of defense so that they're all equal on defense would likely just bring Rep Paladin back up. So again, I don't think we want to do too many massive things, but obviously balancing out the hero talents so that they feel more, you know, selectable between the two for PvP would be nice. And Templar still seems like it's not really getting selected too much. So I think targeting Feral would likely just help Ret. Assassination Rogue, your representation it dropped a little bit. It dropped by 0.3%, it looks like at this point. And maybe that's because you guys tried Outlaw Rogue because that one increased by 0.2%. And again, re-rolling like a class is really tough. Re-rolling a spec, it can work if the stats overlap. So that's probably where you're going to see more of a transition. But we didn't really see too much of a change for Assassination. Honestly, this feels like maybe just like a healthy margin because Rogue is typically very low representation. Rogue is like, you know, it's normally 2% or below, even when it's like a tournament winning specialization or class. So honestly, this feels like a solid spot for Assassination to be sitting. Again, I think it would benefit the same way if certain specs that feel like just a little bit too tanky, a little bit too invincible in PvP were brought down in power, that it would be totally fine with where it is at the moment. And Subtlety is another example. You know, it's a tournament level specialization, but usually its representation is very low because it's completely unique spec. You don't play it like any other spec in the game. And so it's really hard because of that. So its representation is really low, but its representation is honestly decent. Considering its historic average at this point. And you stayed about the same, 5.4%, no change overall. So I don't think like something for Subtlety Rogue. I mean, at the tournament level, obviously, you know, if we bring Feral Druid down in power, you know, it's a Feral Rogue meta. So definitely keeping an eye on Rogue, but Rogue is also receiving some really big changes in the next patch and could have detrimental effects on its viability, right? So doing too much now with it might not be the wisest move. Now I think, you know, preferably maybe looking at classes that counter it is a better option, like buffing Ret. We saw even with the Demonology buffs that Demonology was actually making Trill have a run for his money with the Abjured team playing Shadow play. I think it was also playing Affliction. So there are definitely some options that can still kind of keep Rogue in line. So it's probably okay with where it is at the moment. Survival Hunter, your representation is literally almost exactly the same as where it was. Survival, again, it's kind of like the hipster spec. Not a lot of people play it, so I feel like 5% isn't really that bad in terms of representation. I think it still feels decently strong. Arms Warrior saw a pretty big jump. You went from 3.78% to 5.25%. So again, anything that's like above a 3% or 4% shift in representation, I think it's a lot of the people who don't want to play Fury that re-rolled, that's the drop there, that went into Arms. Demolish is hitting really hard. It seems like survivability is still the problem. You have a lot of melee that have lower levels of survivability. I say lower, but it's like reasonable levels of survivability. And then you got things like Feral and Windwalker that just never die. So I think bringing Tony down the Never Die tier would be a better direction. But I think Arms Warrior is going in a healthy direction since the changes. Demon Hunter, your representation went up a bit. You got bumped by about 1%. From last week, from 2.29 to 3.14. The buffs felt like the least impactful on Demon Hunter, especially seeing it in the tournament. It still feels like your defense is honestly, again, in a reasonable position, but your offense is just not there. So I think like a little bit of a damage buff to Demon Hunter would be wise here. I think when we're dropping below 5%, these are the classes that likely do need like a little bit of PvP tuning adjustments, and brought up a bit in power. Frost Death Knight is also at 2.2%, which went down a little bit from last week. Just maybe it's people abandoning their Death Knights as a whole. Frost, Frost's problem is that it just doesn't have like a ton of single target. It's kind of the way that the class is built, and it's designed to be like this 2-target cleave AoE class, unfortunately, and that just doesn't really shine in Arena specifically. Now, Enhancement Shaman, we also have seen a little bit of a decline from 2.35% to 2.21%, and Enhance, much like Rogue, is getting a really big update in the next patch. So it's one of those specs where like if you giga buff it and then the rework comes in, I don't know if it's going to put it in too much of a spot. I was expecting it honestly to be a bit higher from my experience seeing it in solo shuffle, at least. In the tournament setting, it just feels like it can't do enough damage against the classes that are just like on the unkillable tier, right? Like Feral Druid and Shadow Priest. I think that's its main problem, because typically, you'd pair an Enhancement Shaman with a Warrior, a Windwalker, and a Shadow Priest would be quivering in their boots to that type of composition. But due to their durability, which we'll look at the specifics of it in a second here when we get to it, it just seems like Enhancement is struggling, and it's struggling for the same reasons the Warriors are and Windwalkers are in terms of mobility, is because of all the prevalent range DPS that have such great tools for kiting them in Arena specifically. Outlaw Rogue, you got a little bit of a buff, and representation went up about 0.2%. And Rogue is typically, a lesser represented class as a whole, at least when it comes to Arena, because it's generally considered to be, the most challenging spec or class in solo shuffle. I don't know how you really bump this up, because it's kind of like a big playstyle difference between Outlaw, Subtlety, or Assassin. I feel like a lot of rogues, this is all opinion, right, consider Assassination, Subtlety to feel more like a rogue, and then Outlaw is kind of like a brawler, almost like a pseudo warrior. So I don't know how many rogues want that fantasy. Even if you were to, let's say, Subtlety and Assassination and Outlaw by all means were perfectly equal in power, so it was purely a playstyle and aesthetic choice in terms of what you would go, I would kind of anticipate Outlaw still to be kind of on the lower end, but it could likely benefit from at least a little bit more of a damage bump than it got last week. Just kind of keep creeping up the damage bumps for it specifically, and that includes basically any of these melee that are kind of on the lower end. Now, ranged, we saw a pretty steep drop off for Affliction. Affliction fell about 2%, which was expected, but then we saw Chanimal in the tournament absolutely destroying everybody. So the potential of the spec is still there. It's just a lot harder to get the effective damage off with it. And because it was so popular at the start, I think its overall percentages are going to still remain high for some time because of the friction, as I explained. To switch to something else, you have to level it, you have to gear it. There's a lot of stuff you have to go through, and I think most of the average players, even 1800 players, are just decently high rated. When we look at another bigger problem, which is that there's literally no one above 2400 still. We need some MMR, okay? We need some MMR. We need some MMR right now. Right now, we need the MMR, because, there's not a single player above 2400 in NA. EU, once again, superior region, with Chan, I think, being the first player to get 2400 in Shuffle. But Affliction fell a bit. I think it was to be expected. I still think it's decent, but it's not as easy to get away with a lot of stuff on it. You have to be like really good at it now, as opposed to just kind of like you get a Haunt Shadowbolt combo and you kind of two-tap people. Marksman Hunter also saw a drop. Now, they received defensive nerfs, but I didn't expect them to fall off as significantly as they have. They also dropped about 2%, which I think is fair when they were leading like 18% over a huge margin towards these other DPS specializations. So these ones falling down by this margin is probably like a healthy amount. I think they're still both decently strong specializations, even despite the nerfs that came through. And then, as expected, oddly enough, 666 here for the Shadow Priest, they went up about 3%. So much like Feral Druid, not Feral Druid, much like Unholy DK, a 3 to 4% change is a pretty big shift. And I think the main reason for this, during our discussion, we mentioned Void Leech. which is a hero talent for Void Weaver. And Void Weaver got big buffs, so a lot of Shadow Priest re-rolled to it. I think this is a big reason why Shadow Priest is as durable as it is. Every 2 seconds, you siphon an amount equal to 3% of your health from an ally within 40 yards if they are higher health than you. So when you pair this up with a Feral Druid who has, you know, the King of the Jungle, and they're receiving 20% more healing, you leech the Feral health into the Shadow Priest. The Feral Druid's healed to full very easily. You pair a Holy Paladin with it with Beacon of Light that's just healing all targets. This Void Leech, the negative effect of it is basically not felt, and the Shadow Priest is just getting constant passive healing, which has been, you know, the main culprit that I think Blizzard was trying to tone down, whether it's for PvP or PvE for this expansion. And this is an outlier that's doing a significant portion of it, and leading to why, you know, players like Prev can basically tank Fury Warriors and Windwalkers completely unscathed and undisrupted in a lot of situations, which I think is it's over the top, because that's not where Shadow Priests are supposed to excel in my mind. So targeting that specifically, I think, would be nice in terms of bringing down their defense. Devastation Evokers, you saw a little bit of a drop as well, from 15 to 13%. So I think they nerfed your Eternity Surge by a slight amount, but I don't think this is like a terribly unhealthy amount for Devastation. You're still, you know, solidly above 10%. Frost Mage, you stayed about the same, which honestly is surprising because you got pretty significant buffs towards your Frostfire Bolt. But I think the main problem for Frost is that it's just Hunters and Feral Druids are very difficult to deal with, and there's a lot of them, as you can see, between both sides of the graph. But Frost seems to be just really good still. It's just in a really solid spot. Not much really else to say about that. Beastmaster Hunter, you stayed in about the same spot even despite the defensive nerfs. So I think, again, Beastmaster Hunter, it's probably on the climb, probably coming up. Again, I think Marksman, if you had all specs to be evenly powered, Marksman would still end up being kind of the dominant based on just fantasy alone for popularity. But I think this is a healthy margin. Elemental, you crept up a little bit from 4.3 to 4.9, almost a full percentage point. Elemental, we see a little bit in the tournament, has a bit of success there. I'd say it's like okay on the ladder. It can feel difficult to have like significant impact on swaying a game because you don't have any like big burst mechanics outside of, you know, an Urshock like that. It feels like you're kind of tickling most of the time, but its defense is really good. So I think that's what's holding it in this strong position. And Elemental is getting a big update. I haven't seen a lot of Stormbringer LEs. I don't think that the buffs actually made Stormbringer viable on this patch. I wish that I could try it. I have Mastery gear for Resto, so it's not like, yeah, hard casting Mastery build is not going to be great to try that out personally. But Stormbringer on the next patch might start to see some possibilities, especially if you got like double caster and you know that maybe you're not going to get attacked or something like that. Destruction, we saw you increased slightly by 0.3%. Destro is just getting kind of outshined by Affliction, I think, at this point, and you have to cast a little bit more and maybe disrupt it a bit more. But I think Destro is honestly really good. I'm surprised to see its representation this low. I would have expected Destro to be kind of here at the 8% margin. So I don't know if it's just people are so excited that Affliction is good for once, so all the Warlocks are playing that. And maybe this will spread out a little bit more as the season goes on, because I actually think Destro has strong potential at the moment. Again, its lethality towards classes like Feral Druids, Windwalkers, and Shadow Priests is low just because their defense is high. So helping the viability of these specs just comes with nerfing the defense of some of these specs at the top. Demonology saw a big bump from 1.74% to 3.67%, so a 2% increase for Demonology. They seem to be on an upward trend, moving into a good direction. Boomkin continues to remain about the same, dropping a little bit from 2.8 to 2.64% this week. Again, defense is the main problem for them, but I don't want Boomkin defense to get like buffed to the point where we're Windwalkers and we never die, because I think just the game is in a really unhealthy position whenever there's any specialization like that. You can't just like shift it one way, you know, like this class was invincible here, so now it's the class that instantly dies, and now this class that instantly died is now invincible. That isn't, you're just switching who is making the game not fun. It's just the survivability needs to come down across the board equally on the specialization. So, but Boomkin's representation is still decently low, right? Sub 3% is pretty low, but we still see it making it into top 4 of tournaments. I've #1 Boomkin in Shuffle at the moment, but I think offensively it's really good. It's just defensively. It doesn't help also that a lot of the embellishments that I want to use don't work in solo shuffle. They don't reset between rounds, because I got a bunch of embellishments to make myself more tanky. I got versatility at high health, and I got the shield proc at low health, but the shield proc at low health doesn't reset between solo shuffle rounds. So you only get that literally like the entire shuffle. You get like 1 proc because it's 6-minute cooldown, or it's only 4-minute cooldown. So if that embellishment worked and you were a little bit tankier in that regard, I think it might help a bit, but it's unfortunate. Fire Mage, you doubled. You went from 0.5% to 1%. I played Fire Mage. I got to 19. I also had a 2K rating at the moment, actually, on Fire Mage. For all you guys that were telling me I only upload clips against noobs, I'm coming for you in the comments section, okay? There's going to be a video pretty soon, okay, of me on the Fire Mage at the top of the ladder. It's not easy, though. I got to sweat. I got to sweat a lot in order to win on it, for sure. And that's mostly just due to its defense. If you see something like a Hunter, you are squealing and running for your life, like, no, please get away from me. And it is very hard. It is very hard defensively. I think the main advantage of it at the moment, from what I've found, is the instant proccing Frostfire bolts. If you get a proc Frostfire bolt and they activate Combust, you can shoot 2 of them in a row, and they can hit for upwards of 1.3+ million damage each, and that can give you a chunky big bit of burst outside of your normal tickle attacks of like Fire Blast and Pyroblast proc. So lining those up has kind of been how I've been able to see success with it. I think it's going in a good direction. I don't know how you buff it defensively without impacting other mage specializations. It's like you could buff the barrier maybe, but we've seen mage be unkillable when they buff the barrier too far, and mage already has insane mobility, so it's like if it has good barriers and can also never get touched by melee, then it's just oppressive in the game. So it's like this is such a difficult thing to tune. You could just continue to just do little buffs to Fire Blast damage maybe, or Pyroblast damage or something like that to try and bring it up in terms of power, but at the same time I think just bringing defense down like they did for Hunter. I think it was a good direction, bringing down the abilities they did for Hunter defense. So just assessing those to maybe Windwalker, Feral, and Shadow, and doing the same in terms of bringing their defense will make Fire Mage feel better as well. Arcane, you fell a little bit from 1.07 to 1.02. Again, this might just been people switching from Arcane to Fire, but it does seem like Arcane is like the hardest spec maybe to even do well on at the moment in Shuffle, mostly because all of your cooldowns, the way you have to stack them together, the moments where you've got to line up your burst, it's kind of like how Destro used to feel before they reworked it so it didn't really require its cooldowns. I kind of don't see that happening in PvE for Arcane just because it's such a staple with Arcane Surge and how they work with their mana, but continuing the trend of just buffing their baseline damage and then possibly cropping down their cooldown damage is really the only thing I can see for it, because it just has to hard cast so much more to every other range specialization in the game that you can get crippled really easily in that regard. And also it's going to have the difficulty of penetrating the defense of a lot of the higher ranking, higher represented specs, so bringing down their defense will benefit it as well. Augmentation Evoker, you stayed at about the same at 0.7%, no change for you here. I don't really know. I haven't seen a lot of Augmentation Evoker to really talk about this. So to me, Augmentation Evoker often just plays like a tank spec where you're just like, you give everybody shields and heals. So I don't really want it to be super strong if that's how it's going to be played. But I don't have a lot to say about it because I just really don't really see it a lot. When we look at healers, we saw about a 5% drop for Discipline Priest from 39% to 35%. It's still definitely, at the top or upper echelons here. Holy Paladin saw an increase of about almost 4%. So that's a big swing. And Holy Paladin is, it's really getting represented at the moment. I feel like it's Holy Shock instant healing. It's the main reason Disc and Holy are so good, is that the instant healing is really strong on them. So I almost kind of want to say Holy Paladin might have got overbuffed, but maybe if we see the defense brought down, Feral and Shadow Priest, we have seen games where like Holy Paladin to get targeted in tournament play and they kind of go down pretty quickly. So it might just be that Shadow Priest and Feral Druid and things like that are enabling them to stand out more, and that they do actually have weaknesses, but when you couple them with the synergies that I've explained earlier, they just really get oppressive. Preservation Evoker went down about 1.5%. Preservation Evoker is a really solid healer unless you see a Subtlety Rogue, and then you're just immediately just like, oh no, I can't do anything, help me please. It's your Achilles heel. I don't know if that's just the way it's going to be, or just a spec. You have one spec that counters you, and if you see that, you're really sad. You have tools that can kind of sort of outplay it, like pre-time stopping goes, or pre-deep breathing goes, or trying to get a nullifying shroud to delay a go, or something like that, or rooting the rogue to run away. But it generally feels like at least subtlety rogues can really bully you. But on the shuffle ladder, you're still doing really fine because it's hard to coordinate those types of attacks on a subtlety rogue, and you don't really see them a lot. But in a tournament where their best players in the game are going to play whatever's the best, you do tend to see it a lot. Resto Shaman, you received some pretty big buffs. You went from 6.5 to 7.24% representation. I think I mentioned in the last video that I'd really like it. So with Farseer, if you cast Riptide, it also applies Flame Shock to a random target, because it just feels really impossible to balance healing and actually getting Flame Shocks out. That would make the Farseer talent a little bit more of a competitive option, enable you to actually squeeze damage at globals out, because you really just fall off. These other healers just all do significantly more damage while also having really strong instant healing. And Shaman it's just got decent instant healing and can never actually have time to do damage. So making it so it's easier to do damage. It would also remove maybe a keybind for Flame Shock if you didn't really want to keybind it, if you can just prog it from Riptide. And Resto Shaman just has so many keybinds. So I think bringing down the keybinds would be nice. But you did see a little bit of a jump. Not much, but a little bit. Resto Druid, not surprising to see you drop by 1%, considering you just they give you a 5% buff and say, no, not in PvP. The Cenarian Ward change didn't really have too much impact. I think Shaman and Druid also are very vulnerable to Purge, which is super heavy at the moment between Hunter, Shadow Priest, and Devastation Evokers with how viable they are at the moment. Having lost Adaptive Storm, I think, was a huge deal as well for Resto Druid in terms of overall healing and Purge protection in that regard. I've kind of honestly been enjoying a not Resto Druid meta, if I'm being honest. I think Resto Druid meta, out of all of the years of tournaments that I've played, is probably the most boring meta, at least when Resto Druids are incentivized to sit 80 yards away because they have increased range and do nothing but press instant hots. I just don't like that gameplay. I really don't. So I don't know. It would take a lot, I think, to shift Resto Druid into like a clone playstyle, which honestly it kind of is right now. You really do need to clone in terms to be viable. But shifted into more of an aggressive play style. So it's not just like this sit 80 yards away and you're super oppressive. Mistweaver Monk, we saw a little bit of a drop from about 0.2% from 4 to 3.8, which I don't think is surprising. You just don't really do damage. Like you'll see like these two, Resto Druid does a bit of pad damage, but it's not like any real meaningful damage. Mistweaver does like pretty much just next to no damage unless you're fist weaving, which is just really a liability when you're fist weaving in this current meta. But I think maybe in 11.0.5, when they're giving you like crackle damage and stuff like that, that Mistweaver might see a bit more of a resurgence. And I mean, you could just buff its direct healing. It's tough to balance it with BG Blitz. I really think they just need to look at movement speed on carrying flags in terms of balancing Mistweavers. Because it's like, sure, they're good for throughput, but the main reason Mistweaver is strong is just crazy flag carrier. So looking at more of those as opposed to throughput mechanics. It's the same thing with DK. Like DK, sure, it did high throughput in BGs, but that wasn't the reason it was really good in BGs, because it's Death Grip and Chains of Ice. So people can't move. So you're still going to see high representation, but now it's completely crippled in almost all parts of Arena. So like you have to be really careful when you're making changes if you want to consider balance for BGs as well as Arena, because BGs might not be about throughput. It's more often about like utility, kit, mobility, and what you've got in that regard. So there needs to be other ways to look at that, because it's a dangerous turn, right? Mistweaver just got a bunch of nerfs because of BG Blitz. It already wasn't great in Arena, and it's really falling off. Holy Priest, he went up a little bit, even despite not really seeing any changes. Seems to me Holy Priest could use like a mana buff. It was like decently competitive in the EU region with Zenlin playing it, but more often than not, it was just, oh, he's out of mana again. Oh, he's out of mana. And even though it has like decent mana tools, he's using them on cooldown. You're just falling out. You're just running out of mana faster. So a little bit of a mana adjustment for something like Holy, I think would be really good. But generally speaking, the season is, reasonably well balanced, I'd say, out of all of this, a lot of seasons. The healer balance could do a little bit of a tune up, but even there, it's like, you still got solid representation amongst the top 3, top 4 positions in that regard, 6-7% and higher with this. Maybe bringing down some of the Oracle hero talents. God, there's so many different versions of talents. I don't remember the name of them. Bringing down some of the Oracle talents might be a way to get Disc Priest, but again, if you do it too far, then maybe it just falls completely off to the bottom. You don't want that either. So difficult place to balance. I think looking at Feral Druids and Shadow Priest defense has got to be like at the forefront here. Possibly Windwalkers, possibly a little bit of a look at Subtlety Rogue as well. But overall, I'm having a lot of fun with it. I think I'm having a lot of fun with the game as a whole. I think the tournaments have been some of the most awesome tournaments. We've had crazy moments as well. If you've missed any of them, definitely check it out. So I'm hoping that we'll just continue on this direction of just slowly tweaking things and adjusting them and trying to get them into that as close to a perfect position as possible. But thank you guys for tuning into this deep dive, this PvP analysis. I hope you guys enjoyed the discussion, and I will see you in the next one.